So you're thinking about upping your POTA game and going out and becoming an activator. Probably a good choice. There's not much more fun than taking your radio out to a park, setting up, and basically having field day all to yourself. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. There are a few more moving parts to being an activator, so let's run through what you need to know to do this safely, successfully, and make sure you have a good time. The first thing I want to do is call your attention to the Getting Started as an Activator PDF guide on the parksontheair.com website. There's unique material in both the video and the PDF guide, so don't skip one or the other. They're designed to go together. Now, in the interest of time and not boring you to death, I am going to assume that you've already been through the Getting Started as a Hunter material. I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the rules of POTA, at least as they apply to hunters, specifically with our expectations around following the DX Code of Conduct. Also, we will talk about it a little bit in the logging section, but for now I'm going to assume that you know what constitutes a QSO, specifically a unique QSO for POTA. Next assumption is that you're already set up with an account and have been logged into the parksontheair.com website at least a couple of times. The biggest assumption is that you've not just been through the hunter material, but that you have actually hunted a few parks. You have some familiarity with a park exchange. You know that there's not really a standard for such things, and specifically that you are familiar with and have used the POTA.us spotting page. If you're missing any of the prerequisites here, I strongly suggest that you go back, dot those I's, and cross those T's. It's not impossible to be successful as an activator without this background, but you're making it way harder on yourself and some others than you really need to. All right, with the background out of the way, let's run through the couple of extra rules that apply to activators in the POTA program. Just like hunting, the rules are few, far between, and it doesn't take much more than common sense to stay within them. The first rule is pretty obvious, but following it can sometimes be a little trickier than you might think. In order for you to be an activator, you have to be in the park. You and your radio and your computer and anything else you're using have to be physically within the official boundaries of the park. Now, again, maybe this is obvious, but the official boundaries for the park are determined by the officials running the park, not by the POTA administrators. So while the POTA maps are great for locating parks that are in the program, you need to transition to resources provided by the park administrator to find out precisely where the park boundaries are, and also to get information about where within the park you may or may not be allowed to be. There is a notable exception to this rule, and that is for trails. Depending on what region you're in, there are different trail programs that will have entities that are part of the Parks on the Air system. For instance, in the U.S., we have both the National Historic and the National Scenic Trail systems. Many of those trails are part of POTA. You are not required to sit in the middle of the trail in order to run your activation. In fact, you specifically are prohibited from blocking the trail for other users. So the rule is that you and your station must be within 100 feet of some official part of the trail. Once you've figured out where you're supposed to be, the next thing is to figure out when you're allowed to be there. Almost all parks have some kind of hours of operation, sections of the park that are closed seasonally, or other temporal restrictions on when you're allowed to be there. You might technically be well within the park boundaries, nuzzling the nose of your car up to this closed and locked gate. But clearly, the park is not open for business, and so you shouldn't be there doing an activation. As activators, we're the ambassadors for POTA, and for that matter, ham radio in general. So this kind of gray area of the rules operation is seriously frowned upon. And the third and most obvious rule yet is that there's nothing about being a POTA activator that exempts you from any other park rules. And the park rules are, frankly, whatever the park ranger says they are. If the ranger tells you you can't put tent stakes into that field, then you can't put tent stakes into the field. If the ranger says you're not allowed to put a wire in a tree, then you're not allowed to put a wire in a tree. Many parks will require you to get a special activity permit or pay some sort of a fee in order to do a POTA activation. Whether you think this is fair or right or not, the rules of the park are the rules of the park, and the rules of POTA are that we abide by the rules of the park. Okay, so much for the park rules. It boils down to if you act the way you would act if you were taking someone else's grandchildren to the park, you're probably going to be okay. The other set of requirements for activators is that they log their activations. Now, hunters have no such requirement. You can hunt to your heart's content and never fill out a log. But if you're the activator, you're going to be required to submit logs to the Parks on the Air system. And this requirement exists whether you have a quote-unquote successful activation or not. If you make a single QSO while at the park, the expectation is that you will submit a log for that QSO so that the hunter will get credit. In order to submit those logs, there are a few standards that we're going to have to adhere to. The first of those is that there is one park per log file. Now, many activators will activate multiple parks in the same day. That's fine, but if you do that, you're going to have to create a new log file for each one of those parks. Conversely, if you happen to be at the same park across multiple UTC days, maybe you went to Yellowstone for 2 weeks, that's fine. All of those activations can be in one log file because it's all the same park. So, new park, new log. New day, not necessarily. As you learned in the Hunter course, there's not a set exchange for POTA, and so the fields required for a log entry are really pretty minimal. Essentially, all you need is the timestamp of the QSO, call sign of the other operator, the band and mode on which you were operating, and if the other operator happens to also be in a park, you're going to need their park number for this to be a park-to-park contact. Well, this is the minimum set of data needed, but there's no harm in logging more stuff if you want to. Most of us as activators will log signal reports, and typically if the hunter gives us a state, we'll write that down too. There's no harm in these extra fields being in the log file that you submit to the POTA. On the subject of the required fields, remember that it's one of these fields that's going to have to change in order for this to count as a contact towards your activation total. In the case of time, it's going to have to change to a new UTC day. Just like logging the extra data fields, there's no harm in logging what will end up being duplicate contacts. Just know that they're not going to count towards your activation total, and if you happen to notice you've got a dupe, you might want to let the hunter know too. Now we come to the first requirement that people sometimes trip over. In order to submit your log to the POTA system, it's going to have to be in an ADIF file format. And for all you computer haters out there, that unfortunately means that eventually your logs are going to have to be in an electronic format. Nobody cares if you want to use a pencil and paper or a stone tablet and a chisel for that matter to collect the data during your activation. But at some point, you're going to have to put it into an electronic logging program that can export an ADIF compliant file. We're working on a whole series of videos that show how different popular logging programs work with the POTA system, like this one for N3FGP's AC log. If the program you want to use isn't on the list yet, drop us a note either on the Facebook page or over at help@parksontheair.com. And finally, once you have your shiny new ADIF export in hand, you submit it to POTA by emailing it to your regional coordinator. Your regional coordinator is determined by the numeric character in your call sign, regardless of where you are in the world. I'm N3NWV, so I submit my logs to K3@parksontheair.com. If your call sign was Victor Echo 4 Alpha Bravo, then you would submit your logs to Kilo 4@parksontheair.com. The regional coordinator will take care of uploading your log to the POTA system and will drop you a note and let you know whether or not the upload was successful. Do be patient with this process. It could take up to 2 weeks. These are people who are volunteering their time, and 10 of them have to handle the whole planet. Believe it or not, that's all you need to know in terms of rules and regs to be a POTA activator. The creators of the program have done an excellent job of keeping the rule set simple, sensible, and giving you as much freedom as possible to enjoy your activation. The complexities of being an activator don't come from the rules. They come from things like putting together an efficient field portable station, or finding the right spot and time to be in that spot, and then, of course, running the pileup when you get there. So those are the topics we're going to cover in the next couple videos. Stick around, it should be fun.